creation myth of Ptah?
You want me to talk about
Yeah,
the
just
origins of
yeah.
the creation story? That particular story, the men fight theology,
Yeah.
or what you would correctly call the Mennefa theology. It talks about basically that the Necha Ptah rose up out of the abyss, out of the Nun. And these things are documented on something called a Shabaka stone that's in the British Museum. So basically, the Menfite theology is talking about the Necha Ptah, or the god Ta, as it was originally called, rising up out of the Nun. Now what you have with the Nun is that you're talking about the primordial substance. This is the way the Egyptians talked about and codified their information in reference to the origins of the universe. So as Ptah, as the creation story goes, rises up out of the Nun on what is called the Tajanin, or the primordial hill. This primordial hill brought it to existence with it, the Necha Atum. But before we deal with Atum, there's something interesting about the Ptah myth. As I said before, the Necha was called Ta, T-A. And the interesting thing about that is that as Ta rose up, and in the Medu Necha, that word Ta is the verb to create. It equally means land. And with Medu Necha, they would actually spell words backward and forward. As Ta spelled backwards is At. If you look at a certain concept in Western civilization known as the Relativity Theory, when the Africans of the Nile Valley codified these things, and you have Ta coming into existence, you have land, and thus you have space. As you have space, as I said, you spell Ta backwards is At. You equally have time, because At in Medu Necha means moment. It's represented by a hippopotamus head, a symbol of the sun with a single stroke. So what they had codified is their understanding of space-time continuum. They understood that when matter came into existence, or what you would call form coming into existence, you equally have space and time simultaneously coming into existence. So as Ptah rose up out of this primordial matter, out of this stuff called the Nun, and the Atum sitting on top of Ptah, the Atum brought with it the seed syllable of the word and the desire of Ptah. Ptah had the ability to transfer to Atum the ability to use the word and thought to bring about creation. And it is the Atum that created the gods. And the myth says that the Atum named the 8 parts of his body. The 8 parts of his body would be this concept of these 8 deities that the Egyptians would call, in the Medu Necha, Khnum, or Kaminu. This Kaminu would later be transferred to the 9 deities that they call the Pesjitu, that the people call the Enid, in reference to this Greek rendering, the Greek names of the 9 specific deities. As Ptah rose up out of this abyss, primordial types, female and male, that is represented as frogs and serpents. They were called Nu, and its female counterpart, Nut. Nehu and Nehuhet, Keku, or Ku and Keket, Amun and Amenet. They represent the concepts of like nothingness and heaven, or darkness and light with the possibility of light. infinity with the possibility of temporal time, and that which is unknown, the Amen and Amenet, that which gives you the possibility of knowing. They're represented by four particular qualities, which is nothingness, nowhere, infinity, and darkness, are these four primordial types. As the atom rising up on Ptah began to create the gods, the netures, if you will, it created the things that the Medu Neter text said it issued, it spit forth, Shu and Tifnu, Geb and Nut. And it went on to spit forth Aset, Asar, Set, and Nebuhet. It is these that they label, Western theologians label these things the gods of order, from the gods of chaos. The word God is an ill-suited term to define these concepts in reference to the Africans' understanding, because they use the term Neter. And when you look at this term Neter, N-T-R or N-T-C-H-R, you break it down dealing with something that the Africans would call the naming of a thing that the Greeks would render in their language onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia concept is a concept where you have a word like boom and cuckoo. Onomatopoeia concepts is the naming of a thing where you use the characteristic of that thing to give its meaning. Excuse me. And an example of that is with the Medu Neter symbol for the owl, which is the M. It would become the M in the Western language that we use throughout Western civilization. The M in the Medu Neter in reference to the owl, it means from, of, in, among. And what it represents is the nature of the owl itself. The owl has the ability to use superior sight and hearing to find out where its prey is. So therefore it understands where the sound is coming from, where this entity may be. It hunts in the dark, and it is of the dark, and it is among its prey. So the priests of the Nile Valley did not arbitrarily choose a particular symbol and say, well, that look good or this look good. They studied the nature of that symbol, and that's how you get the alphabet. So if you know the onomatopoeic representation of a symbol in reference to a phoneme, you automatically understand what it is trying to say, because most words that begin with M are going to carry the meaning of from, in, of, out of, among, like move, motion, motive, things of that nature. So this will give you the ability to decipher certain things. So in the Memphite theology, when these forces rose up out of the Nun and Atum spoke them into existence, I'm talking about Aset, Asar, and all of these, we are of the belief that this is chaos. And most people think that chaos is some type of disorder, some type of random dispersion of energy, where things are happening without a plan, in other words. Chaos comes from a Greek word, and it comes from the word actually for chasm. And a chasm is actually a fissure or a hole in something. And chasm also means to yawn. So you see, it ties back to the word of the Creator. And you know, most people would say that Ptah is the supreme God, but Ptah is not the supreme God. The Egyptians called this force, which they didn't understand, they called it Wa Ente Senu, which means the one who has no second. It did not have a temple. It did not have a priesthood. They had no images to it to represent it, because they didn't know what it was. They only codified and represented things that were knowable. And they did not know the supreme deity, the force behind creation. Ptah is a representation of the thing that you can know. And if you look at Ptah's name is actually the anagram, if you shift the letters around, for the word path. Because this is how creation comes into being, through a path, through a channel. So when you're talking about chaos, the African idea of creation is not one that comes out of some erratic, unordered type of circumstance. It's highly ordered. Their take on creation is that when creation happened, man brought about chaos. Chaos was not there in the beginning, but chaos, if you deal with lexically what chaos means, chaos does not mean disorder. Chaos means a fissure or a yawning or a hole. In other words, in the primordial substance, there was something that opened up, this chasm. As it opened up, something came out of it, this primordial hill that you call Ta or Ptah. This place that we talk about is the central axis of the universe, which no one knows where it is, because in reference to physics and astronomy and astrophysics, they're talking about the universe is separating, just going in different directions. But sooner or later, they theorize that it will come back together and collapse on itself. So this idea of the creation story amongst African people, that it came out of disorder, is not one that Africans hold. They say that it came out of something that was organized, because Ptah said that he carried in his heart and his tongue the desire of the Creator. If that was chaos, then he could not carry rules, orders, and laws exactly as was depicted by the Creator, to carry it and transfer these things onto Atum. This Atum is the same concept that you have in the Bible that you have that is called Adam. Since D's and T's are linguistically the same thing, it doesn't matter whether you are saying ATM or ADM. And which is one of the areas of confusion in Christianity, because if you're talking about the creation story, you cannot create people before you have a place to put people. So as in the Egyptian story, land or Ta came into being before people, even before the Necha. So space had to be, and it's the same thing in the biblical story. When you study Hebrew, you find that the word Adam means red earth. So Adam is then an elemental type rather than an anthropomorphic type. Eve then, or Kava, as is stated in Hebrew, would then be the primordial anthropomorphic type that comes into being after a place has been established for humans to dwell. So when you look at it from this perspective, then it's the same concept as the Memphite theology. It's the same train of thought and logic that you cannot have people, you just can't have people suspended into space. They have to have somewhere. And that Adam that we talk about is the earth. You're talking about the ground. So this is basically what you have in the Memphite theology. These things that are recorded on the Shabaka stone is an understanding of, and let us deal with this also, that the Egyptians do not have one creation story, because they said that the complexity of creation cannot be told simply by one creation story. You cannot tell the multiplicity of creation by one story. They had many creation stories. They had the Memphite theology, the endocosmology, the study of the creation story in reference to Khnum, and all of them have their prominent place in the sector of the universe that it was designed to explain in reference to its codification. So as one creation story deviating away from the Memphite theology is the endocosmology, or the endotheology. that you would know as the Greeks would call the Heliopolis, that the Africans call Anu. In this creation story, as Atum carried the logos in the Memphite theology, the Bennu carried the divine word in the logos in the Anu cosmology. So what they have is equally the Nun, and what rises up out of the Nun is the Ben stone, what would come to be known as the Tenkanu, or what they would call in English the obelisk, or what the Greeks would call the obeliskos. It is from here that this thing rose up, just like the primordial hill in the Memphite theology. And the Ben stone rose up, the bird, the Bennu, perched upon the Ben stone. The Bennu bird made a sound, and the sound permeated every nook and cranny in the universe, in that particular state of the universe, and enunciated in creation. It brought in the forming of matter. But one of the things we have to understand is that matter was not created. Matter was only given form. Matter was always, it just didn't have form. It is through the word that matter is given form. And it is the Bennu that screeched and made this sound that brought about the forming of matter in the Anu cosmology. Now, why is that important, and how can we trace the legitimacy of that? We can look at ourselves. We are called a person, and this term person comes from the Latin word persona, which means per meaning through and sona meaning sound. So we are who we are because of sound. We are called a person because of sound. And if you deal with the sexual act itself, you can understand how this carries out and shows you the truth of what the ancient Kemetu people were talking about. For example, during the sexual act, people make sounds. And those sounds, or it may seem funny, but people make sounds like ah, eh, oh. And we even say, oh God. These are like the vowel or the seed syllables that brought in and brought about creation. These are the things that the people of the Nile Valley, especially in Kemet or Tamari, would call the Heka. Every African people has something that is called the words of power. It exists amongst the Yoruba people, the Ewe people, all African people have this in their priesthoods. Because what you're talking about when you talk about creation, everything emanates from thought, word, and deed. Because before any word was spoken, before there was any sound, there was a thought process behind it. That thought process brings about the word. The word gives your thought a vibratory reality in the physical realm. Then you have a deed or a ritual or something that concretes and seals that process. That's basically what prayer is. Prayer is the ability to think a thing, speak it into existence, and do something to sustain it, to make it stay in this realm. And that's basically what the creation story is. When you talk about words being used by African people, they are copying the creation act. And in many African societies, you are not anyone until your name is called. The naming of a person is emblematical of the sound of creation. If you deal with any type of act that concerns doing anything in reference to energy, like a fire burning, electricity transmitted through wires, you hear a sound. Now, during creation, there were only certain entities in existence who witnessed the sound. So the naming of an individual in African culture is in keeping with the way that we understand creation progressed. So therefore, you are given a name because that name is emblematical of the sound of creation. If we see someone, to give you an example, and we don't know who that person is, we ask someone, who is that? And they say, oh, that's John, or that's Kwaku, or that's whoever. You see, because it means nothing. If we see somebody that we don't know, we'll say, who is that? If we see a woman, what's your name? So it is important for us to have that sound associated with that particular energy pattern or that particular form of matter, which is why the spoken word carried through African culture has a prominent place, because it actually imitates creation. That's why sound is so important to us. And as a matter of fact, one of the parts of the soul called the Ren in the Egyptian spiritual system, your name is part of your soul. And in reference to what the Bantu people call the Ina is that part of your soul that can die. And part of the process of dealing with that, which Europeans label ancestral worship, we're not actually worshiping ancestors. We are paying homage and venerating the people who preceded us. And one of the integral parts of that is stating the name, saying the name of that particular person. So this is why the name and sound has a prominent place in spirituality, in our life, because it imitates creation. And as it would come down to us, it finds itself being displayed in many different ways. So when you talk about, for an example, the way that we deal with morality, the way that we deal with right doing, our whole lifestyle and our action is geared and centered around using words to regulate behavior. You see, everything people do, it doesn't matter if you are operating a camera, if you are a stonemason, if you are an apprentice carpenter, if you're an apprentice filmmaker, everything you do culminates from your understanding of what you are told. Nobody just comes into a situation where you come onto a site and just start doing things. People direct you through the word. So the word is actually what creates. If you have someone that's an apprentice in a building trade, whether that's ironworking, let's say, then that particular individual is schooled through the word by people who know things that they don't know. And they instruct those people into how to assemble this steel or this wood or this stone or whatever it is you're doing. All that happens through the word. Everything that you see that is anything functions through the word. And if you see someone doing a certain thing, when you approach them, you ask, what's your name? Or what are you doing? Or you're not doing that right. You should do it this way. So the word is creation. It is that way that the word creates. So you have an impediment if you have someone who is deaf and mute, and you're trying to show them a certain way or methodology to do certain things, and they can't understand. It's even haphazard if you have individuals who speak different languages on an assembly line that you're trying to teach them particular processes. Then your product is not going to be complete. It's not going to go along at the speed at which you want it to. So the word is prominent in creation.
The concept of history transfer and a certain group of individuals with the job of keeping the records of the people and everything. Tell us the importance of that in African society. it's important to keep that, tradition alive as far as the oral aspects, of the historical transference.
Well, I think it's very important because if you look at Kemet or Tameri, people like to use the term Kemet, but especially among Afrocentrists. But the priest of the Nile Valley called that particular place Tameri. They use the term Kemet sparingly, and most of the countries along the Nile began with the prefix Ta. And amongst these peoples who kept humongous records, more than anyone, you might say, in antiquity, they placed an importance upon the word. When you read the writings of Kanima or Imhotep or some of those people, they used the word to direct the individual. And they went so far as to call their representation of the script divine speech, the Medruneche, the words of God. That it shows the connection between the Creator and man in reference to in his utterances. That what you find a priest called a curry head. The curry head was the chief lector priest. Curry is a word that you will find that became the word Christ because it used the phonemes KHR, which is the same as CHRISTOS, Christos. The KHR is the individual who had reached a certain level whereby he conducted ritual through the word. He's the one, the name actually means he who is under the ritual book. He who carries the ritual book. If you deal with that word curry head and you look at the correlation in English of the word carry, you see where it comes from. Because if you're under the ritual book, you carry the ritual book. This man, priest, actually is the template for what you would call a MC, Master of Ceremony, which is the Western transliteration of the Medruneche, because curry means master, and heb means festival or ritual, what you could call a ceremony. So he is the master of the ceremony. So what they have in Western civilization goes directly back to Africa. This man is the individual who did the oratory, the lecture about what is to be done, how it is to be done. He carried the sacred word. He was the custodian of the sacred word. And it is from the records that they kept. And mind you, nothing that they kept was plain, because they codified what they wrote. It was only for those who were worthy to know it. So African people didn't really write things plainly. They would write in codification. So it's important to understand the function of a jelly. And one of the things that fascinates me is that how in our collective memory we carry things from Africa to America. One of those examples is that you have a man in jazz called Jelly Roll Morton. Okay? In the West African tradition, you have a jelly whose job it was to perform. He would sing the history of the people. He would remember the genealogy of the people, who could sit there and lecture for days and never repeat himself. The jelly was usually a person who was apprenticed to his father or his grandfather because they were in a family tradition. The word jelly actually comes from a root that means a bloodline. So they would carry this information from father to son, uncle to nephew, what have you. Now, what they would do is go around the country and perform the history of the people. When you do a study of the jelly in West Africa playing the kora, which is a 21-string instrument, or the marimba, you find the origin of the blues. When you listen to music from West Africa, you hear the blues. The blues were not created in America. Often, getting back to Jelly Roll Morton, he was not called Jelly Roll just for the hell of it. Jelly is just a form of Djelli. So he is fulfilling the same function that the griot or the jelly did in West Africa. If you notice when you listen to the blues, it's always about some moral lesson that they're trying to convey. This is something that was not created in America, but something that was created in Africa because they were an oral people who would tell their history through song, through dance, and through playing musical instruments, because in many cultures the instrument could actually talk because the African language is tonal and they can make the instrument speak. In that tradition, the brother that we know is Jelly Roll Morton, who arrogantly say that he created jazz and that he created the stomp style, that he was not called jelly. When we think about jelly, we think about preserves and stuff like that. But that's not what the jelly that they're talking about. And it just goes to show you how in our collective memory, we bring things from the continent and use them and don't even know why we're using it. So he was called Jelly Roll because he was actually an individual who brought the message, the codification of culture in song to the people, where he would perform these routines. Because if you notice, even today, you find people who will quote blues songs like "I Can Do Bad by Myself" and things like that. These are the idioms and the mores that they would use for the Ma'atian principle, or what the Akan would call the Ja, the principle of right doing. Many people listen religiously to songs and pattern their life after the lyrics of songs. This is an African tradition because this is the way that morals was taught to the people. Because the jelly would not only tell the history, but the jelly would bring the idioms and the codes of right doing to the public when he traveled to different places around the country. So the jelly was also a poet. The jelly was an entertainer. And even though he had a low status in reference to society, he was highly respected because every court, every king had a jelly. As in the case of Sundiata in Mali, he had individuals who job it was, because every jellies had to be tied to people that they could give advice. Otherwise, they served no purpose. So if you study the life of Sundiata and what Sundiata was talking about in Mali, you would see the role of the jelly and how important it was, because they were given information that's passed down collectively for hundreds and thousands of years that they would impart to the king, because when the king wanted advice, he had individuals, this jelly that he could call on, and the jelly could recite certain things. So they were the custodians of moral fortitude, of moral behavior that were ingrained in them and held in their collective consciousness. So rap stars and poets today and blues singers and rhythm and blues singers don't know the tradition that they follow and their responsibility. The jelly would not go out there and sing a song that would cause disharmony in society. The jelly would bring a song to the people to teach you morals, to teach you how to act. And if poets today and rap stars and rhythm and blues artists understood their role, because still people have in their collective consciousness the purpose of what an entertainer does, because mostly they belong to secret society. When you listen to Robert Johnson talk about the pact he made with the devil at the crossroad, jellies are not only people who are musicians, they're also priests. And many of them won't tell you about the supernatural stuff that they deal with. So but you hear all of this when you listen to people like Robert Johnson say he made a pact with the devil, and things that he did at the crossroads, too much selling his soul, things of that nature. It only goes to show that the jelly is tied to the traditional religion, and they have, like as I say, they have a prominent place in society today. If artists would look back and recognize the responsibility that they have to the people who listen to them, and not just make any type of record. Like you have people in the rap genre today, I mean, like Trick Daddy and all these people make songs that are just worthless. It's not to say that they couldn't make things that are sound and productive, but they're doing it for money. And they don't care about the product that they put out. In African society, the jelly understood his responsibility to the people and to society. The priests understood. In ancient Kemet and all throughout African society, these people were priests, and they knew that their job was to maintain balance in the world. It's like that they are the police of society.
Something in particular that you wanted to address that wasn't specifically asked, what would you say, as far as anybody wanting to know, because, we're trying to tie, what we do in the collective consciousness, what you say, back to, saying our ancestors in traditional ways. So what would you say, that individuals, should do, or, any kind of advice, where should they, what kind of direction should they go into, things of that nature?
Well, I think one of the things that's very important, our ancestors at the temple at Warit, or what is known as Karnak, and the Waset, they had over the door, man, know yourself first, so that you may know the God and all other men before you. And most African cultures that I've looked at often talk about self-knowledge and the importance of self-knowledge. For us, we need to look and examine certain things that Western society propagates in the world. For example, like Africans could not write before Arabs came. Africans had no script before the Europeans came, and the Europeans are arrogant enough to say, well, these people had no writing to speak of. But when you do what Jock talked about, do your own research, examine yourself, you find there are numerous African scripts that are pre-Islamic and pre-European. These scripts are ideographic, phonological, syllabic, and object. They are scripts that the Mende people had and have. That's pre-Islamic. So the Mende people were writing. The Vir people, the Yoruba using the Iroko script, which is an object script. There are other scripts that are used in Africa, in Cameroon, scripts amongst the Chukwa people that live in Ngolu or Angola. And this is all tied to the word. This is all tied to spoken word. Not only were we dealing with oral knowledge, we were dealing with written knowledge. So many of the things that people see don't recognize as script because they deal with what the European call an alphabet. Africans have syllabic scripts, objects that depict 2 syllables or 2 phonemes. So we were writing in antiquity. We were actually writing in the Stone Age. So what we like to talk about Medu Neter and the things that is shown in ancient Egypt. But in the ancient Batu nation in the Congo, Africans were writing. Africans used to send message boards, message sticks to different kings. Now, if you happen to be the one to bring a bad message, they killed you. Now, that's another story, question the morality of whether it's right or wrong, but the harbinger of bad news was usually killed. So they had ways to write and communicate. And we need to understand that we shouldn't depend on European interpretation about the word, because the word comes from Africa. It came out of Africa. One of the things that we need to look at when we assess different things, like for an example, make a long story short, we have this thing we call an alphabet. Not knowing that Aleph in Ugaritic, or the ancient Canaanite, is the ox or the cow head. The cow head is a symbol of the mother's womb, which is why it's the first letter in the alphabet. Bet means house. So alphabet means house of the cow. The house of the cow head. That symbol of the cow head is not someone worshiping cows. It's just that the ancient Africa knew that the reproductive organ of a woman looked like a cow head. This is the same thing that the Hebrews reverted back to with Aaron and Moses when they did this statue of the golden calf, which is they were not worshiping a calf. They were paying homage to the reproductive organ of woman. And we all come from the reproductive organ of woman. They are venerating their mothers, and all mothers. But because we do not understand symbolism, because we think that the symbol is the message, but the symbol only brings the message. So what we need to do, one of the things that I suggest, is that we go back and study myth, symbolism. Because myth is not the truth. Myth actually means 2 truths, and you cannot have one interpretation of a myth. It must have a minimum of 2. It can have more. So we have people, as the disciple of Massey said, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, he talks that the man in antiquity had his myth interpreted. Today we have things that come from antiquity and we don't know what they mean. We take the literal meaning, but in the ancient time, the ancients never taught truth plainly. Truth is always codified. The Book of the Dead is codified. The Bible is codified. But you find many people who would attack sun worship. The Bible is sun worship because Holy Bible, Heliobiblio, mean the book of the sun. The sun book. It's not talking about the sun that you're worshiping it. It's talking about the way that light brings knowledge, as opposed to darkness bring ignorance. So one of the most important things that we can do is to realign ourselves, to realign our consciousness with the ancient past, because many of the things that we call superstition, many of the things that we call pagan, is deep esoteric knowledge. It's not understood because it was never written or presented to be understood plainly by the uninitiated. It was written as mnemonic information for priests. And all mnemonic information is a key that you are taught orally about a certain thing in your training, and you can revert back to it as a symbol, and the entire syntax or the entire story comes back to you because of mnemonic keys that are left. That is what is left in Egypt. You can't go on the walls of Egypt and look and study the temples and thinking that you're going to get some information that's going to do you any good, because it's written in a mnemonic key. If you do not have the key, then the information means nothing. If you do not have the key to Book of the Dead, it means nothing. And it's that way with all of Africa. You can go to the Adinkra, start to read it, and you don't know what it means because you have to be part of the culture. You can go amongst the Chukwa people, the Yoruba people, any people. They don't teach plainly. They may say certain things, that's an idiom, and if you're not a part of the culture, then you don't know what the idiom is saying. You interpret the idiom literally, but that's not what the idiom is saying. Our elders used to tell us certain things. They would say, a dog that bring a bone will carry one. Meaning that if someone comes to your house gossiping about someone else, they'll leave your house with some gossip to tell someone else. But the ancients just say, a dog that bring a bone will carry one. So people will actually start thinking about a dog. But you can't interpret it literally. It's codified. It's codified mainly, for one thing, because during this creation that we talked about before, the things that happened were concealed. Because if you weren't there, then you don't know what went down. You have to access certain things that were there. Like in Yoruba culture, they talk about Orunmila. And they call Orunmila by a praise name, meaning that he is the witness to creation. He was there and witnessed creation. So you find many of these similarities all across the continent. And in every system you always find an individual. Like in ancient Kemet, you find Jehudi. Amongst the people in Babylon, you find Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the deity that dealt with the sciences. So there's always a divine messenger. Amongst the Romans is Mercurius. So we have to do a comparative study of things. And once you do this comparative study, you see that most of the things you think happen independently are actually what the German Adolf Bastian called elemental Gedeigen. Elemental idea. Gedeigen is the German word for idea. He also said Volkgedeigen. Folk idea. Volkgedeigen is, he said that things happen in reference to myth, that somehow there was this facade, but as people moved away from each other, they would differentiate certain things. They would create differences to make them stand out. This is the Volkgedeigen. So you could have, what he was talking about is two brothers who came from the same people. They get mad with one another. They would institute a facade in their spirituality or in their culture, in their society, to differentiate themselves from each other. But he said, actually, when you do a careful examination, you will find that there is elemental Gedeigen, that there is folk idea. In other words, it all comes from a common template. It just looked like it's different. So basically, what we need to do is to find that elemental Gedeigen amongst African people. And as we see that common thread, and we find that we're not as indifferent as we think, whether we Christians, Muslims, or whatever, or the different denominations of Christianity. Plainly put, we are at a threshold, we're at a point now in the world where we have to do something. That if we don't do something, that there are people that's going to destroy the very place that we call home. And it's not going to be able to realign itself in time to save humanity. The earth will be here, yes, but life as we know it won't. So basically, African people, as the custodians of this planet and the original people, we dropped the ball because we have not adhered to the word. We've not adhered to what came from creation and was given to us so that we could take care of the very place that we call home, where spirits come to get educated.